Okay, so hello everyone. I'm still Katalin Reszegi, and this is the second lecture of this semester of Onomastics Online, the online lecture series that provides students and researchers with state-of-the-art discussions on the topics related to the different aspects of proper names. And I am really happy to welcome Carole Hough, who supported this initiative from the beginning and has helped a lot since then. And I'd also like to welcome Pavel Stepan, who is the chair of this event. So thank you very much, Carole and Pavel, for accepting our invitation. And as always, I wish a wonderful time for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katalin. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to open this lecture of the Onomastics Online series. And as Katalin has already said, today's speaker is Carole Hough, Professor of Onomastics from the University of Glasgow, and her topic is metaphor and metonymy in names. So please, Carole, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pavel, and many thanks to Catalina and the ICOS committee for organising this series of online lectures. The last 40 years or so have seen a huge burgeoning of interest in metaphor and metonymy within linguistics. Much of it stimulated by the publication of Lakoff and Johnson's popular book, Metaphors We Live By, in 1980. Both metaphor and metonymy are non-literal types of meaning, once thought to be primarily literary devices, but now believed to be fundamental to ordinary language and communication. Briefly and simplistically, metaphor is where one concept is understood in terms of another, as in the phrase, "I see what you mean," where the concept of understanding is understood in terms of seeing. Metonymy is where one concept stands for another, as in the phrase, "The back row applauded," where the back row stands for the people sitting in the back row. In linguistic terms, metaphor is where the two concepts belong to different domains or areas of experience, while metonymy is where they both belong to the same domain. In the back row example, the domain of a theatrical performance, or possibly an in-person lecture. Names can be used both metaphorically and metonymically. Using a modesty topos to suggest that my knowledge of onomastic theory is less impressive than that of a previous speaker in this lecture series, I might say, I am no Richard Coates, using the name Richard Coates as a metaphor for an expert in onomastic theory. Using one of the transparent names that Richard discussed in his talk, the White House objected is an example of metonymy, where the White House stands for the government of the United States. This lecture approaches metaphor and metonymy in names from the opposite direction, looking not at metaphorical and metonymic uses of names, but at the role of metaphor and metonymy in the creation of names. My main argument, building on a paper I gave at the last ICOS Congress in 2021, is that the role of metonymy in particular has been significantly underestimated. The recognition of this may, I hope, lead to a better understanding of the origins and development of names of different kinds. Here's how the rest of my talk will be structured. First, we'll look at some of the most common types of metaphor in place names. Then we'll move on to surnames, looking at both metaphor and metonymy. Then we'll look at personal names, trying to decide between metaphorical or metonymic interpretations. Finally, we'll come back to place names, but in connection with metonymy. The single most common metaphor in place names is landscape is a body. In linguistic terms, the target domain is landscape and the source domain is the body. The conventional formulation is to set this out in small capitals. Target is source, or landscape is a body. So far as we know, this metaphor appears in all the world's languages, and it appears in ordinary language as well as in place names. Most of my examples will be from England and Scotland, because those are the countries whose toponymies I know best. But even within Scotland, we have place names from at least 6 major languages, and this metaphor is found in all of them. From Old Norse, we have Armadale, referring to a long or arm-shaped valley. Dramochta shows us a Gaelic word for the spine, used of a ridge, while Durness uses an Old Norse word for the nose to refer to a headland, something that juts out, like the nose jutting out from the face. Gurrock is from a Gaelic word for pimple, used of a rounded hillock. In Hassington, an Old English word for the neck refers to a long valley, while leg uses a Gaelic word for the shank, part of a leg, to refer to a long piece of land. Just like Durness, Stranraer uses the Gaelic word for nose to refer to a headland, showing how the same metaphor occurs in different, unrelated languages. Here's another illustration of that. Clagan in the Scottish Highlands is from the Gaelic word for skull, and it refers to a skull-shaped hill. Exactly the same metaphor appears in the biblical name Golgotha, which is from an Aramaic word for skull, also used of a skull-shaped hill. The alternative name Calvary uses the Latin word calva, also meaning head or skull, in just the same way. All the metaphors we've seen so far are based on shape. Shape is the single most common motivation for the landscape is a body metaphor in place names, but it's not the only one. There are different motivations for the metaphor, or to put it another way, different aspects of the source domain are mapped on to the target domain. The second most common is position, as in cheek law, where the position of the cheek on the side of the face is mapped on to the side of a hill. Kinross uses a word for the head to refer to the end of a promontory, again mapping the position of the head at the extremity of the body onto the position of the site at the end of the promontory. Another motivation is function, as in lossy mouth, where the function is that of an orifice. Another motivation is texture, as in Melrose, a bare moor, where a Brittonic word for bold is used to refer to lack of vegetation, mapping boldness, lack of hair, onto a landscape lacking vegetation. As we can see, some metaphors are shared between place names and non-onomastic language. Mouth is the standard term for a river mouth in ordinary English. It has become what is sometimes known as a dead metaphor, although this term has been challenged and may no longer be appropriate. Other metaphors only appear in place names. A metaphorical meaning of Scots cheek is only found in place names. We also find metaphors from the internal body, as with the adder, with a word for a vein or an artery used of a watercourse. We find metaphors from the healthy or diseased body, as with lennel, a lean or unproductive hoch or water meadow. Also from the animal body, as potentially with the Isle of Skye, if the name is from a Gaelic word for wing, referring to the shape of the island. And from the clothed body, as with the central belt of Scotland. The supernatural body is also represented. The devil's elbow is a double hairpin bend towards the top of the Cairnwell Pass between Glenshee and Braemar in the Scottish Highlands. These or similar formations are replicated in different languages throughout the world. And indeed, the latest issue of the Ungagan Information Bulletin, which is now kindly circulated to all ICOS members, has a fascinating item on a cave in Bulgaria known as the Devil's Throat. If you haven't read it yet, I strongly recommend it. In short, the metaphor is highly productive in place names as well as in ordinary language. The second most common metaphor in place names is landscape is a container. This too is widely evidenced. Churnside in the Scottish Borders is a rounded hillside, shaped a bit like a milk churn. Corrie on the Isle of Arran is from a Gaelic word meaning cauldron, applied here to a hollow between hills. The Solway Basin, also known as the Solway Plain, spans the border between England and Scotland and is drained by the rivers Esk and Lynn. Again, we can see a continuum between ordinary language and onomastic language. Basin is the standard English term for a river basin, whereas a metaphorical use of churn, a vessel for making butter, is unknown outside place names. And of course, some names are ambiguous. The delightful name honey pig just outside Glenluce in Dumfries and Galloway, literally means honey jar, from a Scots word for jar. But it is unclear whether this is a metaphorical reference to sticky soil or a literal reference to honey production from beehives. Other types of names are also ambiguous between metaphorical and non-metaphorical interpretations. Surnames are traditionally divided into 4 main categories: location, relationship, occupation, and characteristic, depending on whether the description of the original bearer related to their place of origin, family connections, rank or occupation, or a physical or mental characteristic, real or perceived. The third category, occupation, is most likely to involve metonymy, while the final category, characteristic, is the most likely to involve metaphor. We shall look at metaphor first. Earlier, I mentioned a previous speaker in this series, Professor Richard Coates, among whose many achievements are that he led the project that produced the 4-volume Oxford Dictionary of Family Names in Britain and Ireland, which transformed the study of surnames in the UK. As well as providing new and more robust interpretations of surnames, the dictionary provides a range of insights into non-literal uses of terms. Non-literal uses of terms then. 3 examples are on the slide. We begin with wren, where a physical property of the bird, its small size, is mapped on to the surname bearer. Then with fox, a perceived behavioural quality, not an actual behavioural quality, but one traditionally associated with foxes, slyness, is similarly mapped on to the surname bearer. As we can see from the words perhaps and probably chiefly in the definitions, these interpretations are not wholly certain. They are the best available, but there is room for doubt. For instance, another possible motivation for fox, suggested by some surname dictionaries, is red hair. In the entry for crow, alternative possibilities are put forward, denoting someone with dark hair or a dark complexion, or perhaps a raucous individual. Here, although we know the etymology of the surname from the bird name crow, there is a variety of interpretive possibilities, all representing metaphorical mappings of different attributes of the bird. Here's the entry for gudgeon, where the etymon designates a species of small freshwater fish which has a large head and is easily caught. Here again, there are two possibilities, one based on the mapping of a physical attribute, the large head, and the other based on the mapping of a mental attribute, stupidity. Most English speakers today are unlikely to be aware of either attribute. I certainly wasn't. It is particularly fortunate that the gullible sense is on historical record in the Oxford English Dictionary. This was clearly shared knowledge during the surnaming period, the period when surnames developed and became fixed. But it can no longer be considered to be so today, at least not outside the fishing industry. We shall come back to this point in a few minutes. Fish names are surprisingly common as surnames, again reflecting the greater familiarity with different species of fish during the surnaming period. Here's the explanation of salmon in the Dictionary of Family Names. No doubt, note the hedge here, indicating that there's no actual evidence. No doubt given to someone who caught, sold, or ate the fish. This is different from the other examples we've looked at, in that it is not metaphorical. No attribute of the salmon, physical or mental, real or perceived, is being mapped on to the surname bearer. But it isn't literal either. It's metonymic. The salmon and the person who catches, sells, or eats it are all within the same domain of the fishing industry. Also, unlike the previous examples, the ambiguity of interpretation means that the type of surname is also ambiguous. If it refers to someone who characteristically ate salmon, then it's a characteristic surname. If it refers to someone who caught or sold it, then it's an occupational surname. Exactly the same ambiguities apply to herring, probably for a dealer in herrings, occupational, or perhaps for someone who habitually ate the fish, characteristic. But both interpretations are based on metonymy. Many occupational surnames are metonymic, using the names of animals or commodities to denote people working with them. Examples are cheese, sheep, and whitbread. Cheese, probably denoting a maker or seller of cheese. Sheep, probably for a shepherd or a dealer in sheep. Whitbread, probably denoting a baker or seller of white bread. Notice again that the word probably appears in all three entries. These are reasonable conclusions, but they are not presented as certainties. Indeed, the entry for cheese specifically points out that the term may be applied in some other way. There is a wide range of surnames for which metaphorical or metonymic interpretations are possible, and which are therefore ambiguous between occupational and characteristic surname types. The entry for fish treats it as either an occupational surname for a fisherman or fishmonger, hence metonymic, or characteristic surname for someone thought to resemble a fish, hence metaphorical. Trout is explained as either for someone who caught or sold trout, or for someone who was thought to resemble the fish in some way. The only way in such ambiguities can be definitively resolved is where there is prosopographical information on the original surname. The book gives 3 possible explanations, all of which may account for different occurrences of the surname. A professional falconer, metonymic, occupational. Someone of a savage or cruel disposition, metaphorical, characteristic. Someone who held land by providing hawks for his lord, metonymic, occupational again. In at least one instance, though, it can be linked directly to the third alternative, someone who held land by providing hawks. Ralph Havoc, who owed the Royal Exchequer 2 hawks in 1130. Prosopographical information like this is precious as the only definitive evidence in favour of one interpretation rather than another. In some entries, the Dictionary of Family Names doesn't attempt an explanation, but simply gives the derivation. I've chosen an animal name, a bird name, and a fish name. If you are watching the recorded lecture, you might like to pause the recording at this point, have a look at these surnames, and think about what the possibilities might be. Which surname category do they belong to? And are they metaphorical or metonymic? For those of us here live, we'll carry straight on. Bull offers perhaps the widest range of possibilities. It could be metonymic for someone who works with bulls and hence an occupational surname. It could be metaphorical for someone who is large or strong and hence a characteristic surname. It could also be metaphorical for someone who is clumsy and hence characteristic again. I don't think there's any reason to believe that bulls actually are clumsy, but this is a perceived quality, and so just as likely to give rise to a surname as a genuine quality. Sparrow is more difficult. It may be metaphorical for someone plain or insignificant, and therefore a characteristic surname. On the other hand, although sparrows tend to be thought of as plain and insignificant today, how far back do those associations go? Were they already current during the surnaming period? One sense of sparrow in the Oxford English Dictionary is a chirpy, quick-witted person. On the one hand, that is only recorded from 1861, much too late for a surname derivation. On the other, it shows that sparrows could be perceived in that kind of way. The Oxford English Dictionary also has an entry for the compound sparrow pie, explained as a dish proverbially supposed to make the eater sharp-witted, but again only evidenced from 1881. Are there any metonymic possibilities? I don't know of any occupations associated with sparrows today, but might there have been in the past? Then we come to sturgeon. By analogy with the other fish names we've seen, we could suggest that it might be metonymic for someone who caught or sold that type of fish and therefore occupational, or metonymic for someone who ate that type of fish and therefore characteristic. It seems difficult to explain sturgeon metaphorically, but there may have been associations that we are no longer aware of. As with gudgeon, it's possible that any of these may historically have been associated with particular traits that are no longer familiar to us, and which, unlike the gudgeon, are not on record, and which may have served as the basis for metaphorical transfer. This leads us to personal names. Many of the personal names in present-day use in English-speaking and other countries are from the Bible. And of these, some are from words for animals, birds, and so on. Now, if surnames created within the last 800 years or so are often difficult to interpret, how much more so are these much more ancient names, dating back thousands of years and created within a culture very different from our own. A dictionary of first names by Patrick Hanks and collaborators includes about 210 different biblical names, not including derivatives, of which many correspond to phrases like father of exaltation, that's Abigail, a female name, or helped by God, Azariah, male, like the rest of the names on this slide. Others refer to personal qualities, whether physical, as with Adina, slender, or mental, as with Amnon, faithful. Some originated as bynames, as with Asa, doctor or healer, while others are suspiciously appropriate to at least one of the bearers, suggesting a similar origin. An example is Asaph, collector, the name of several biblical characters, including one associated with some of the Psalms, which Hanks et al. Suggest may have been the name of the writer or of a cantor. A small but interesting group are tree names. These include Esther, myrtle, Keziah, cassia, Oren, pine, and Tamar, date palm. On the one hand, these could originate as toponymic bynames, similar to the surname Willow in the Oxford Dictionary of Family Names that we've just been looking at. On the other hand, they may be metaphorical, similar to the English girl's name Willow, explained by Hanks et al. As from the name of the tree, noted for its grace and the pliancy of its wood. A metaphorical interpretation may be supported by comparison with Zillah, shade, reflecting the importance of the shade cast by trees in a hot country. I'm also inclined to add in Michael, brook, which is the only other name I've found from a topographical feature or plant besides Susanna, lily. It may also be suggestive that 6 out of these 7 are female, a striking proportion, especially as male names greatly outnumber female ones overall. Here I'm still referring to the biblical names in Hanks et al.'s Dictionary of First Names. In the case of the tree names, though, it's difficult to know what particular aspects of the individual tree species are being mapped onto the name bearer. This problem is more acute when we return to the theme of names from living creatures. Just 14 of the total 210 comprise animal or bird names, no fish, And again, the majority are female, 11 as opposed to 3 male names. Also, even of the 3 male names, both Jonah and Ophrah are feminine in form. Here, although the names are from Hanks et al.'s dictionary, not all the definitions are, as I have also benefited from advice from my colleague, Dr. Sarah Nicholson, a specialist in Old Testament studies at the University of Glasgow, and to whom I'm very grateful for her advice. There remain some uncertainties. The etymology of Damaris is very unclear, and others have also been challenged. Hanks et al. Derive Leah from a Hebrew word for languid, but some scholars prefer an Arabic word for wild cow, which is supported by the fact that Leah and Rachel are sisters in the Bible, plausibly bearing the same type of name, both named after animals. With the exception of the problematic Damaris and the Aramaic name Tabitha, rendered into Greek as Dorcas, all the names on the slide are from the Old Testament and hence particularly ancient. What, if anything, can we learn from them? Dembski states that names like Rebecca, Leah and Rachel, referring to calves, cows and sheep, reflect the high regard for these bovines held by the ancient Hebrews. As against this, few other names refer to high value items. And in any case, this would only account for a very small subgroup. I wondered initially if the names might be metonymic, reflecting the role of women in animal husbandry, beekeeping, and so on. However, the occurrence of some terms for wild animals militates against that, as does the tendency for female names to correlate with female animals. That seems to suggest that the names are metaphorical, mapping a quality of the animal, real or perceived, onto the bearer. But what qualities? The only one for which Hanks et al. Offer an explanation is the masculine name Caleb, which, as they explain, is said in some traditions to symbolize devotion to God. It would therefore be metaphorical, mapping the quality of devotion from the dog to the name bearer. Presumably, though, these are later traditions, not necessarily relevant to the original name, as dogs generally seem to be conceptualized negatively in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. The quotations on the slide are fairly typical, and I haven't found any biblical references to good qualities of dogs that we might expect to form the basis of a metaphor. What about Deborah, bee? Associations with honey, sweetness, come to mind. But again, they tend to feature in the Bible as hostile enemies, highlighting their dangerous qualities. The Amorites which dwelt in that mountain came out against you and chased you as bees do. They compass me about like bees. They are quenched as the fire of thorns. Not very positive associations, one might think. Even more puzzling is Hulda, weasel. The one thing we know about weasels from the Bible is that they were unclean. There's a quotation from Leviticus. These also shall be unclean unto you among the creeping things that creep upon the earth, the weasel and the mouse and the tortoise after his kind. Well, Orpah and Tabitha are more easily accounted for in light of the erotic references to Dia in Proverbs and the Song of Solomon. The references to lilies in the second quotation on the slide may also help to explain Susanna lily, the only non-tree plant name that I found represented. And of course, there's no shortage of positive references to doves, from the dove sent out of the ark by Noah after the flood in the first book of the Old Testament, through to the Holy Spirit manifesting itself as a dove at the baptism of Christ in the first book of the New Testament. Jonah and Jemima make perfect metaphorical sense. In short, a metaphorical interpretation can get us some way towards understanding some of these names, but others remain ambiguous or even completely opaque. It seems reasonable to assume that these creatures may have had associations for the ancient Hebrews, like the slyness of foxes in European tradition, the gullibility of the gudgeon to medieval fishermen, or indeed the busyness of bees in modern tradition. These associations may not have been the same as ours, and there remains some really interesting research to be done here. Returning to place names, I started this lecture by looking at metaphorical formations, and I'd like to finish it by looking at metonymic ones. As with surnames, there is a standard categorization for descriptive place names, dividing them into habitative names, topographical names, and folk names, depending on whether the description relates to the built environment, the natural environment, or the lived environment. In other words, whether the generic or defining element of the place name is a word for a building, a landscape feature, or a group of people. As regards folk names, these are clearly metonymic. This was recognised by the Celtic name scholar W.J. Watson almost a century ago, when he wrote, "In very early times, the name of the tribe or population group served as the name of the territory which they occupied." The earliest record of the name of the Picts, a group of Celtic inhabitants of Scotland, is in an 8th century source known as the Ravenna cosmography, preserved in manuscripts from the 13th to the 14th or 15th centuries, which uses the Latinized form Picti to designate the area where they lived. There's a close-up on the right of the slide. This system of using the name of a tribe for the name of their territory continued until at least the early Middle Ages, with names such as Norfolk and Sussex in England referring to the North folk and the South Saxons, respectively, and Cunningham and Simprim in Scotland referring to tribes known as the Cuiningers and the Simpringers. Some types of metonymy are productive or conventional, which means that they follow an established pattern which others can be slotted into. My earlier example of the White House is one of these, as the seat of government in any country can stand for the national government itself. Similarly, people for place is a conventional or productive metonymy in place names. Moving on to habitative names, these are names where the generic or defining element refers to a building or a group of buildings. Ayton in the Scottish Borders means settlement on the River Eye from Old English. Balgowan means settlement of the smith from Gaelic. Kirkby means settlement with a church from Old Norse. Menstrie means settlement on the plain from Brittonic. Old English tún, Gaelic bally, Old Norse bu and Brittonic tre are all very common in place names, but they still make up only a minority of habitative settlement names. The majority denote individual buildings within the settlement, used metonymically to refer to the whole settlement. Here are some examples, again from Scotland. Words for church and other prominent buildings are common, but so too are words for small, apparently insignificant buildings like houses and cottages. It's sometimes difficult to know why these would have been chosen as the characterizing feature of the settlement, but they must have had some particular salience for people at the time. Thus, Salkets refers to the buildings used in the salt making industry. Again, this appears to be a conventional metonymy in place name formation, part for whole. And finally, topographical names. This is where a settlement is defined in relation to a landscape feature within or near it. Aberdeen, the mouth of the Don. Brodick, Broad Bay. Broxburn, Badger Stream, and so on. This is part for part metonymy, where one element of a domain, the domain here being the landscape within which the settlement is situated, is used to name another element. We've seen Clagan before when we were looking at the landscape is a body metaphor. Metaphor and metonymy often work together. Here, a word for a skull is transferred metaphorically to refer to a skull-shaped hill. And then that is transferred metonymically to refer to a nearby settlement. So here are some of the examples we looked at in the first part of my talk. I've taken out the ones that aren't settlement names. We discussed them earlier as examples of metaphor. Now we can see that they are also examples of metonymy. Thanks very much. I'm very happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
So thank you very much, Carole, for an extremely interesting lecture. And now we have time for discussion. So any questions, comments, remarks are welcome. Katalin, please start.
Oh, I just would like to congratulate our yes, it was a wonderful lecture. I found it really interesting. And yeah, so recently I think a lot and I deal with the perception of landscape and some of the participants as well here. So I think the place names, the metaphorical and metonymical place names and your explanations are really inspiring for us. So thank you. It was really, really thought-provoking for me, at least.
Thank you, Katalin. I think it's a really interesting area to look at. Yes. Shall I stop sharing the slides so we can see each other again?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, do that.
So any more comments or questions? Well, I think we can find some very interesting parallels in other languages as well. If you talked about a transfer of a name of a geographical feature on a nearby settlement, I think in some cases a name, a place name can be transferred on a basis of metaphor or metonymy, also on some faraway settlement or feature. It can be even a transfer of an exonym, for example. For instance, in Czech Republic, there is a frequent microtoponym or a name of piece of land or some group of houses, America,
Mm-hmm.
and there can be various naming motives here based on either metaphor or metonymy. Metaphorical names are based on the fact mostly that the object was far away from the given village, so it was called America as something distant. Or sometimes there was a metonymical connection with people who moved to America and then they came back. So some of these connections. So I think this is also very interesting.
Yes, it shows the importance of actually tracing the individual origins back, doesn't it, and getting local information where possible, because as you say, so many of these names could potentially have more than one explanation. Yes. Certainly in field names in Britain, we have quite a lot of nicknames of remoteness of the type you were mentioning, as with the Americas, places named from specifically from far away places, simply mapping that concept of being at a far distance. Yeah, there are parallels, I think, in so many different languages and so many different types of names.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments?
There is some comment on the chat.
Oh yes, I can see one question about the Donesse example. I don't think that Donesse is intended to mean a headland shaped like a deer's nose. I think the transfer of the nose word to mean a headland comes first, and then it becomes almost like in fact it becomes like a dead metaphor, like the river mouth that I mentioned. So as Keith says in the chat, OED will say that ness, not literally a nose, but the words are cognates. So ultimately, that's the metaphor, which then becomes established in different languages. So the nose jutting out thing is the ultimate etymological origin. In that instance, no, I don't think it's a deer's nose, but I do think that there are a number of genuinely ambiguous examples, and I have spoken about this before. For instance, quite close to where I live in Glasgow, there's a place name called Drum Chapel, literally from drum, which, well, happens to be another metaphor. It's another word for the spine used of a ridge. And then chapel is a word for a horse. And that one, I think, is genuinely ambiguous in a way that Donesse may not be, between whether this is a ridge frequented by horses, or whether it is actually referring to the spine of a horse, metaphorically.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. And my question is in the chat, but I wanted to say, because I think it has gone up a bit. Can you share some most whimsical examples of metaphoric place names you have come across? And maybe some unusual metonymy type that you have come across. So not the usual one, but some out of the way. Thank you.
Whimsical examples, metaphoric names, that they quite often turn up in field names. I think there are some to do with puddings, for instance, and you can never actually call to mind the things you want when you're asked the cuff like that. Help me out, folks. I'm sure some people in the audience can think of some whimsical examples. Anybody like to put some in the chat whilst I'm thinking?
Well, I think I can provide one from...
Yes, please do, please do.
From my material. I was thinking about chapels and churches as names for ravines and crags. So maybe this would go as something. But
yes. Well, we also, and also castles as words for yes. Rocks can also be named after people. There's the Carlin and Daughter is the name of a couple of rocks, one of which is larger than the other. Carlin is a word used for an old woman or sometimes a witch. So Carlin and Daughter. There's also the Cobbler, a famous name of a hill that's supposed to, in Scotland, represent a cobbler bending over his last. That's not one of the lesser known ones that you were asking about. What else have we got?
Thank you, Carole. Yes,
thanks.
That's a cobbler is an interesting one. Thank you.
It is, isn't it? Yes. There's also the Black Bull. That's the name of a rock off the coast of Berwickshire, I think. Again, named from the apparent resemblance.
Okay, any more questions or comments? Not so. Thank you once more. Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture, and see you next time. Or would you like to say
maybe
Katalin?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Pavel, and thank you very much, Carole, for this exciting talk. It was really informative and inspiring, and I think it also gives a good basis for our our next lecture in November, when Rita Brdar-Szabo and Mario Brdar are going to talk about the metaphorical and metonymical use of proper names. So thank you again. And I think these events also provide a good possibility to promote actual information relating to ICOS. So this time I would like to remind you that the next ICOS Congress, the 28th Congress, is going to be held in Helsinki in 2024, and that we are still waiting for bids for the 29th ICOS Congress. So I would like to encourage every onomastic institution, research center, department, and everyone to apply for or consider the possibility of the application for the 29th ICOS Congress in 2027. And you can find every information at our website. So that's all. Thank you, and see you soon in November.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.